Good afternoon, folks. Let's get started. What's the good news or the bad news? We don't have a speaker next week. This is the last talk of the semester. It's also a very special talk personally for me. I will not be running the symposium from next semester, but this is the 5th year I just completed. So this is 10 semesters of me doing this every week. So I brought in about 150 speakers, every time a different speaker. So it's been a tremendous experience, especially interacting with you. I still am super excited that every week we get new faces. I see many new faces around here, and that's a very exciting thing to see. We have a very special talk lined up. This is in the strand of more discussion we have been trying to build at the symposium on international issues, especially looking at major economies like China, India, Brazil, and so on, and what's happening in the energy space there, but also what they're doing, how that all of that ties into issues like climate change and other environmental problems. We have two very distinguished speakers with us today. My colleague, Professor Josh Busby, who is an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Before joining the LBJ School, he was a research fellow at many different institutions, including Princeton, Harvard, and the Brookings Institution. Josh has published very widely in a wide array of publications. He also has a couple of books. Josh, is it 2 or 3 books? Just 2. Just 2. He's working on another one. And he has written many studies on climate change, national security, energy policy issues, very active in this area. We're really delighted that, Josh, you could join us. Our second speaker is going to be Sarang Shidore, who is a researcher and consultant focusing on 2 areas, energy and climate policy and Indian foreign and energy security policy issues. Sarang has about 14 years of industry experience. He holds 2 master's degrees in engineering and 1 master's degree in international studies and diplomacy, so 3 total. We are trying to convince him to get another degree here at UT, but not another master's, a PhD one actually.
One of his engineering degrees is from UT.
Is from, oh, I did not realize that. Okay, so you are a Longhorn after all. Okay, great. I did not realize that. He was most recently associated with the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, a leading New Delhi-based think tank, and co-led a strategic future and scenario planning for India looking out to 2030 and 2050. So please join me in welcoming Josh and Sarang.
Is that working? All right, great. Well, thanks for the invitation. I thought when you were saying this was a very special talk that it had to do with something with us, but that's just me being narcissistic. It's a great service that you've done for the university these past, did you say 5 years? 5 years, that's amazing. Well, we're glad to have the opportunity to present today. If you were here earlier in the semester, there was a similar theme, but from colleagues at LBNL, right, that focused on some similar overlap, but I think there's a little bit of a different point of view, because I'm a political scientist, so some of the kinds of analytical lenses that we'll bring to bear are a little different. The title of our talk is Addressing Climate Change Among the Major Economies, the Case of India. And we're building on previous work that we carried out here with graduate students at the LBJ School. We did a year-long project. We had these year-long projects for a client. In this case, it was for climate advisors at Climate Consultancy in DC. And we did a series of country papers and sectoral papers that are up on a blog site. And we've subsequently, Sarang and I have done several papers for the Paulson Institute, one on China, and we carried out another consultation and conference here at UT with the Stanley Foundation, and there are sectoral and country papers up from that as well. And the sort of intuition here is, when we think about the climate change problem, it looks daunting, especially when we think about climate change negotiations, 190 plus countries getting together. It's amazing that we were able to achieve something like the Paris Agreement last winter, and yet, now we're in the hard phase of implementation. But if you decompose the problem and think about the number of polities that are actually responsible for this problem, I'll come back to this in a second, that there are actually 16 political actors, if we treat the EU as a unitary actor, which is increasingly problematic, that there are 16 political actors responsible for 75% of global emissions. And so when we think about the collective action challenges of organizing and trying to address the climate change problem, it actually looks a bit more tractable when you look at it in terms of who are the major economies, which are the major countries that are sources of emissions. It's actually a more limited set of actors, of which India is an important one. And so what we've done with our previous work with MA students and what we've tried to do with our co-authored work on India is focus on the major economies, focus on the major sectors in those major economies, because to the extent that we're able to break the problem up and disaggregate it, we think it's also ultimately going to be more amenable to policy intervention. And so that requires us to have an understanding both of who the major sources of emissions are, but what are the major sources within those countries, and then thinking structurally through what are the challenges and barriers for emissions mitigation for the sectors within those countries. So let me just back up for a second. Wanted to review some of the research that we've done in this space to date, and also think through of future research that we could carry out, but we're mostly focused on the first piece. And again, we wanted to focus on where are the major, most feasible sectors for emissions reductions within India, looking at the most important contributors, but bringing a structural lens to understanding feasibility, because even within the dominant sectors that are sources of greenhouse gas emissions in India, we think some are more amenable and feasible for emissions mitigation than others. And we bring a political economy lens to this. So it couples both a first point which focuses on the organization and political side of things, and a second that is more technical. And I'll walk you through how we get there. And this is based on background research from existing information sources, but crucially it's reliant on two waves of interviews. One wave that was carried out by Sarang in sort of February of last year, and then I went in December, and we complemented that with a second set of interviews. And this work is currently under review at Energy Policy. So as I said, a handful of countries are responsible for the bulk of global emissions. India currently responsible for about 6% of global emissions, but it's projected to increase upwards on 10% by 2030 under current policies. And there's going to be a spectacular and significant increase if nothing is done to change the trajectory of India's emissions, a major increase upwards of 224% by 2030 if current policies don't change. And so we see that India has made commitments to address its emissions voluntarily through the so-called intended nationally determined contributions that were these voluntary country commitments to address their greenhouse gas emissions as part of the Paris Agreement. And some of those major commitments include things like scaling up of non-fossil energy to be 40% of total electricity generation by 2040. Right now it's about 30%, but that commitment may not sound like quite a lot, but this entails an increase in the share as the total electricity production of the entire system is set to increase dramatically, because you have about 200 million Indians who lack access to electricity at the moment. So India simultaneously wants to increase the share of non-fossil energy as part of the total mix, when the total amount of electricity production that it intends to produce for the country is set to grow dramatically. So this entails a commitment of scaling up solar energy, for example, upwards to 100 gigawatts by 2022. And it also includes some other things on emissions intensity and afforestation. So you have simultaneously India set to become an increasingly important source of greenhouse gas emissions globally, but it also has ambitious goals of scaling up electricity production for its populace, but at the same time trying to do that with a somewhat cleaner profile. Now, what becomes critical is how amenable is the Indian political system and economy to interventions to do both the solar renewable scale up and address emissions sources from other sectors. So that's really the purpose of this paper. So I want to walk you through the theoretical intuitions behind this. As I said, there's a political organizational piece, and then there's what we call a techno-economic piece. And basically, we try to code each of the most important sectors in the Indian economy based on two dimensions of feasibility. And I'll walk you through each of those in turn. And as a political scientist, we love 2x2 matrices. We are in love with 2x2 matrices. And so here is the first of 3 2x2 matrices. There are major one and 2 nested ones. And basically, we try to typologize the Indian economy and by sector and identify which sectors are most feasible for emissions mitigation and which ones are most difficult on these 2 dimensions. So cell A are the hard cases. These are ones in which you have low political organizational feasibility and also low techno-economic feasibility. These are the difficult cases. The easiest cases are ones in which you have high political organizational feasibility and high techno-economic feasibility. That's the cases in box C. The more mixed cases are ones of B and D. B are ones of low political organizational feasibility and high techno-economic, and the cell D are the converse, where it's high political organizational but low techno-economic. Okay, so how do we code these cases? What are the sort of theoretical intuitions for how to code the cases? Well, our political organizational feasibility piece is underpinned by the notion that fragmented systems are difficult for mobilizing collective action, both on the market side and on the political side. So on the market side, if you have a whole bunch of producers that are collectively responsible for a large share of emissions in that space, and if they produce a variegated product lines that collectively contribute to emissions, but there are lots of different kinds of things that are sources of emissions in that space, and if the market isn't nationally integrated but fragmented into a series of state markets, that the collective action costs of organizing the market for emissions mitigation are extremely problematic. And here we might think of the paradigmatic example of the agricultural space, in which hundreds of millions of farmers collectively are responsible for a fairly significant share of greenhouse gas emissions in the Indian context, but organizing Indian farmers, hundreds of millions of farmers, to change their behavior is challenging. But if you have a handful of actors, say in the automobile space of automobile producers, if you have 4 or 5 companies that are responsible for a large share of emissions in that space, then changing their behavior may be rather easier. Now, if they're firmly and implacably opposed, market power gives them political power potentially, but structurally, the market can be changed faster if there are a handful of players. And we've seen that in other examples like chlorofluorocarbon markets. We've seen that in the Indian context of HFC producers, and we're starting to see that with air conditioner producers at the moment. That's on the market side. On the government side, you also face a similar problem of fragmentation if the central government has concurrent responsibility with local, state, and sort of city actors for governmental responsibility over that space. So if the government is a sort of singular federal entity and doesn't face any competition from state and local governments, that is a more favorable environment for emissions mitigation. A fragmented government landscape and a fragmented market landscape is a disaster and very problematic for emissions mitigation. So, as I mentioned, we love 2x2s in political science, so this is the second one of our nested 2x2s. And what we try to do to code the sort of political organizational feasibility piece is to code these 2 dimensions of government concentration and market concentration in the government organizational piece. And that will give our overall coding for government organizational feasibility. So let me briefly walk. This is a little bit more nuanced and complicated, and there's a paper that I can send to you if you want to read more details. But basically, the most difficult cases are ones of cell A, when you have low market concentration and low government concentration. This is that fragmented landscape that I talked about. The other cases are more difficult because you have, in cells B and D, you have one of the parties is highly consolidated and concentrated, and the other one's fragmented. And here we make a case that the outcome depends in part on the power balance between the 2 sectors. And then the last one, you have offsetting concentrated sectors, which on some level favors action, but it also can be problematic if the two sectors have a history of antagonism. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on from this, but you can see at the end where we arrive in our overall coding for each sector, and we can walk you through the Q&A why we arrive at conclusions for each sector. This is the government organizational piece, but there's a second piece, as I mentioned, which is techno-economic. And here, we try to use other people's studies on how far is that sector from its emissions efficiency frontier in terms of energy efficiency or efficiency of its processes for its overall contribution to greenhouse gases. So if it's very far from best available technology in that space, then we code on that dimension that it's low. But there's a second piece to that is even if it's far away from its efficiency frontier, how costly would be the interventions in that space to improve its efficiency? If those interventions aren't particularly costly, then we would also code accordingly, that there are low-cost barriers to abatement action. And those costs might not be super costly in the global sense, but they might be costly to those actors. So when we think about interventions for Indian farmers to reduce their emissions, they're probably reasonably inexpensive globally, but for those actors who have limited capital or mostly small-scale farmers, they're very costly. So again, our third of our 2x2s, another nested one. Basically, we ask how far are they from the efficiency frontier, the distance from best available technology. What are the costs of the transition? And so in this case, in cell A and also in cell B, both of those cases, there's nowhere to go, right? They're already very close to the efficiency frontier. So there's low distance to BAT. They're very close to the efficiency frontier. So it doesn't really matter if the costs of interventions are high or low. They don't have any room to improve their efficiency because they're already at close to global levels of efficiency. The more interesting cases are cell D and cell C. In this case, you have high distance to BAT. They're very far from their efficiency frontier, and the costs are low. So we think of that as a more favorable set of cases. The other cases are high distance to BAT. They're far from the efficiency frontier, but the cost of making those changes are also high. Okay, so I'm going to turn it to Sarang to walk you through what are the most important sectors in India and our coding for all of the sectors. And the payoff of this elaborate theoretical edifice is that we're going to be able to tell you which of the specific sectors in India we think are most favorable for emissions mitigation given the methodology and theoretical framework that I've presented you thus far. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarang, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thanks, Josh, for that laying out all the theory, and thank you to Varun for hosting us here today. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you to all of you for coming. What I'm going to talk about is applying what we've just outlined, which is a theoretical framework, to the specific case of India. So the first, in the spirit of the exercise, since we're looking at the big players in the room, so to speak, right? We started from that. We're continuing in that spirit. We're going to isolate the big sectors that matter. And here the job is relatively easy because you have data out there that tells you how much each sector is emitting, and also some projection studies, not many, but there are some, as to how these profiles are going to change in, let's say, 2030. So those two graphs actually tell you the story. The blue bars are where the emissions were in 2010. The red bars are where they're projected to be from one credible study by McKinsey in 2030. And you have also on the left-hand side, you have the emissions as a percentage of the total. And on the right-hand side, you have absolute numbers, gigatons of carbon, right? So the first thing you'll notice is on the right side, almost everything is going up, and by a lot, right? So as a developing country, modernizing, not too surprising, that's happening. The only sector that isn't growing in absolute terms is this others, which you may wonder what that is. And that really is a bunch of things. The waste is in there. Waste is growing, actually. But then the other big component of it is the using non-commercial energy. So stuff like cow dung, wood chips, rural use of energy, which is going down substantially by 2030 as most of the population gets into the commercial energy space. Apart from that, everything else is going up. And the one other sector that's not going up so much, and in fact is dropping as a percentage, is agriculture. And that again tells you that India is transitioning from a farming based economy. It already has moved out of that in many ways, but is, in terms of the population dependent on agriculture, is going to shift out much more by 2030 into the other sectors. The big stories are on the electricity, industry, and road transportation front. Electricity particularly grows very fast, up to 50% of the total. Now this study was done before the INDCs, so one might wonder what happens if the INDCs kick in. And you can do a rough back of the envelope calculations because you have the targets out there, right? 300 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel energy amounts to about 200 gigawatts of renewables, and that gets you maybe 5-6 points below 50. So you might end up at 43-44%, which still makes it a big player, probably still the biggest contributor in the room. So the INDCs are not going to change the game massively in that sense. They'll still keep the rankings pretty much the same. And then industry is also growing quite a lot in absolute terms, but a little less, but still growing in percentage terms. And transportation is growing really fast. Now, that 6 to 11% jump in some studies is more, right? Some studies 14, 15, depends on what you take as assumptions, but it is growing quite a bit, more, about doubling or a little more than that. So right there we have our first sectors, electricity, industry, and road transportation. But we need to look at that in a bit of greater detail, because it turns out that in terms of electricity, there is one sector that is contributing massively in terms of demand, and that is buildings. So buildings and appliances actually draw a very large chunk of electricity today, 34.3 in that graph, and it's actually growing faster than the other sectors in terms of the percentage of consumption. So that percentage number, 34.3, is going to go up. By 2030, it might be in the late 30s or close to 40. So that's another sector that falls out. And finally, industry, as we know, is highly differentiated, right? Different industries have totally different dynamics and tell you different stories. So luckily, it turns out that three big players in industry dominate the emission space, which is steel, cement, and chemicals and petrochemicals. And of these, actually, the chemicals bit is growing the fastest, and the other two are also growing, but maybe less fast. So we concentrate again on those three and leaving the rest out in the study. And the paper, I hope you received a copy of it. If you haven't, please email us. We can send it to you. But the paper gives you detail on all of these codings. So you can see this table really tells you the two big variables, the political organization feasibility and techno-economic. Within that, there are two sub-variables each. And we have coded it as low or high based on where they stand, each one of them. And then as a composite, we provide for the two main variables an overall score, right? So this graph is got detail, but it's hard to decipher. So I'm just going to go to the chart that explains it and actually throws it up here, and we can use this as a basis of our discussion and Q&A going forward. So here you see where these sectors fall out at the end of the whole study. And by the way, we have also coded, and we can spend, if you have time, we can spend time on that. We also coded the specific two sub-variables for the political organization feasibility. So you can see a little more detail there on the graph. But focusing on this one for now, box A, if you remember, is a hard box, right? That's the one where you have problems on political, organizational, and techno-economic both. And it turns out that three sectors, namely agriculture, electricity, and steel, have the hardest numbers on both of these variables. Now, let me start with electricity, because that's the really big guy in the room, right? With 50%, maybe 44% of total. And it would be nice if it was up in C, right? But as often common in life, the stuff you really want to do is sometimes harder. So it's sitting in box A, and the reason is twofold. On the techno-economic side, you have a significant challenge in getting what you have today, which is subcritical coal, which dominates Indian electricity generation. and will remain the dominant contributor in 2030. Even if you have solar going full steam ahead, it will definitely help quite a bit, but you still have 500 gigawatts plus of thermal, and most of that is coal. Gas is very, very small. There are many barriers to gas and so forth. So you're talking of coal as being a big contributor, and it's currently almost entirely, except for the really new plants, it's at subcritical with efficiencies of around 32%. China has almost all its plants at supercritical or more. So you're already talking of a significant gain, 10 points or more, that can be made if those coal plants are retrofitted to supercritical or beyond. And right there's a very substantial technology gap. And the cost of that is not trivial. The amount of time it takes 6 months or more to retrofit. India is an enormously electricity deficit country, so you take a plant offline, you're having problems there in terms of supplying electricity and so forth. So on that front, there's a problem. Now, obviously, solar is going to help with INDCs. We are going to get a better picture. And it seems like on the techno-economic front, solar is actually favorable. Costs are dropping. Technology is out there. It's not, it's deployed today. It's getting better and better. But still, again, remember, coal will dominate in 2030 regardless. On the political organization side, which is the bigger part of our work, the issue really is quite nightmarish on electricity, because you have fragmentation across the space. You have, first of all, electricity is a concurrent topic, so the state governments and the central government both have almost equal powers. So the central government has perhaps a little more today than it used to, but states are still very powerful. You have independent regulators, both at the central and state levels. You have government ownership of production, but you also have a number of private players, so that's divvied up. And then you have various other problems that come to bear, because you have, in many ways, the market is divided regionally. You do have some large plants, the big so-called UMPPs that supply to multiple states that are centrally owned. But a lot of coal power plants, certainly the coal-burning ones, are owned by state governments, and they supply electricity to their particular states. So you have geographic fragmentation, you have fragmentation of governance, and you also have private and public sector participation. So both sides have power, substantial power, that they bring to bear to the problem. So electricity turns out to be a very fragmented space, and that's why it's sitting in box A. Now on steel, the situation is a little bit interesting, because you have two segments within steel. One segment is what's called the primary segment, where you have basically these big blast furnaces that are producing from A to Z. The whole production process is done from ore all the way to your product. And then you also have the DRI, what's called direct reduced iron plants, which are essentially just generating iron and not going to the next step in terms of generating steel. So the reduction of iron ore is a part which produces a lot of carbon dioxide. So the DRI plants contribute substantially to the carbon emissions, and the primary plants contribute as well. Now the primary plants, it turns out, it's a very concentrated space. You have 5 or 6 players that dominate that space. The DRI segment, which contributes about 40% to the emissions, you have 70 plus players dominating, fragmenting that space. So it's a mixed sector, and that's why it's sitting sort of close to the center of this box. On the techno-economic front for steel as well, there are challenges. In many ways, the DRI segment is far from frontier. It uses coal, and the standard really is to use natural gas. It will substantially reduce the emissions, but there are major problems on natural gas in India, and so you're sitting quite far from the frontier on that. In the primary segment as well, from the reports that we were able to access, that we don't have Indian steel at the frontier of production. Now there's a scheme called PAT, Perform, Achieve, Trade, that's run by the Bureau of Energy Efficiency in India, that has brought the steel industry, as it has some other industries, closer to that frontier, but it's still not at the frontier. So in both places there's work to be done. I think Josh just mentioned agriculture earlier. So agriculture you can easily see. You're talking of literally Indian farm sizes are small to medium. You don't have a huge number of large land holdings in India. That's not the norm, with some exceptions. So agriculture is a massive collective action problem of organizing hundreds of millions of people. The cost is not high in the macro sense of the term. There's certain practices that need to be applied. Some of them are actually about education. It's really about how do you cultivate rice better? Can you drain the fields in the middle of the process and things like that, which don't cost a lot of money, but they do require information, education, persuasion to relatively far-flung and massive communities that are not often within the informational space. So you're talking of a fair bit of challenge to overcome that. And again, the parts that have to be done in terms of spending money, the individual Indian farmer is not well off. In fact, there's a lot of deprivation in the farming community. There's been a lot of suicides and stuff. So the cost globally might not be that high, but the cost for the individual farmer is substantial. And so you have, again, agriculture turns out to be unfavorable on both fronts. Now in the happy box, so to speak, on box C up there, you can see two sectors that we think are more amenable to action. And we are not saying that these shouldn't be tackled, by the way. That's not the conclusion. But just in terms of which perhaps may give us which are more amenable from the structural argument, which is fewer players, fewer product lines, easier to change, if you can get them in a room, that sort of thing. And it turns out that road transport and petrochemicals may have some favorable indications to tackle. And of those, the road transport is an interesting one, because if you look at the production side of road transport, if you look at which players produce the cars and the two-wheelers and that sort of thing, there are very few. A few players dominate this space. The products, there are many different cars on the market, but fundamentally the technologies are not massively different. So you're not talking of very radically different product lines that will take enormous amounts of new solutions to change in each car model, so to speak. So you're talking of a favorable situation in road transport from the supply side. There is, however, a caveat to this. The demand side of road transport is fragmented, right? Because it's hundreds of millions of people who drive their cars, the way cities are planned, potential for sprawl, all of that is an issue. And transportation studies will tell you that that's as important as having cafe standards. So there are two parts of the puzzle. And one part is much more amenable than the other. But I think, we think that the producer end of it is actually structurally amenable to change. And mind you, India does not have robust cafe standards. I mean, it's been very late to that game, and there's still a long way to go before it achieves the kind of aggressive reductions it can achieve in this space. On the petrochemical side as well, it's interesting because you have, it's a very vast industry, right? You have many millions of hundreds of products or thousands of products at the downstream end. But in terms of carbon emissions, the two big contributors are oil refining, and which provides you the feedstock, and also the production of intermediates. And the paper has the details on that, so you can look that up. But fundamentally, when you map those, you find that you again have a concentrated set of actors that produce these key building blocks for the whole industry that contribute the most carbon, right? And on the techno-economic front, we actually had a little bit of difficulty in getting publicly available information for the whole industry. You don't have a lot of information out there on the Indian petrochemical industry on carbon emission footprints and projections and maybe reports on what are we doing and what we did right and what we didn't do right. That sort of thing that you get in some of the other places more easily. We had to rely more on interviews for that, and what came out of that was that again there is fragmentation. You have a set of public sector actors or government-owned petrochemicals plants that don't do very well on the techno-economic front, and then you have private sector actors like Reliance with their Jamnagar facility and others that are state-of-the-art. Now, of course, state-of-the-art on paper, how they operate it, we don't know, but we can assume that they're doing definitely better than the public sector entities. So petrochemicals again has a bit of a mixed situation, but remember, substantial ownership of production is with the government. Majority ownership is still with the state. So there's quite a lot of scope here for improvement, and again, you have few actors that can make the changes if they want to and are incentivized to. So that's the story on that. Just quickly summarize, I know we have limited time, so I'm just going to summarize fertilizers and cement. That's the easiest story. They're already on the frontier or close to it. Cement in India is one of the most efficient industries out there. It's come a long way over 10 years. It's a participant in global initiatives like CSI and so forth. And it's, I think, second only to Japan in the world. It's more efficient than actually the processes in the US. Fertilizers as well is quite efficient. The interesting story there is fertilizer plants are mainly state-owned. And with that reality, they have come a long way on efficiency, which is a bit counterintuitive, because all the other sectors you get a different, you get the private sector folks at the cutting edge, the public sector lagging. Here they have done a good job, and maybe there's a paper there somewhere in terms of why the public sector actually acted in this very subsidized, very regulated, very old world kind of an industry, right? This is not IT exactly. So, that's just an open question that we still have right now. Buildings is a really fascinating topic, because if you're looking for the biggest bang for the buck on the engineering side of the analysis, there's nothing better than buildings. Having green buildings built, you're talking of only a few % greater investments, and the payoff is massive. The recovery is within a couple of years, and then a building lasts, 30 years, 40 years. So you're talking of big savings down the road. 70% of Indian buildings that will exist in 2030 are yet to be built. So you have a lot of scope for just not retrofits, but greenfield change, which is easier than retrofits typically, right? So you'd think this is a fantastic. The problem there is it's got fragmentation written all over it. At every level of the space, Indian buildings sector is fragmented. You have, not only is it the jurisdiction of cities and states, but the central government also has a role in terms of designing programs, disbursing seed money, setting standards. Developers are fragmented. There are a few big names, but if you look at what % of buildings they build, it's a small fraction. So really, it's a nightmare in terms of getting collective action done. Perhaps the worst case, well, agriculture would perhaps compete with that, but so you have unfortunate combination of these two, perhaps the best techno-economic feasibility and perhaps one of the worst political and organizational feasibility on that one. So that was sort of a summary of the big sectors. And if you look at, since our work is mainly in this space, we thought we'd throw up this figure as well that tells you where they sit individually on market and government concentrations. And I sort of brought that up in my last 10 minutes, and you can kind of just mentally map that and see if you see any questions or anything you want to get clarified. Yeah, so I guess that was, so I'll stop here for the moment. We have some other slides on, but maybe we'll take Q&A first.
The only thing we'd say is, we did a sectoral analysis here, and our next effort is to do a deeper dive into a number of different other areas. So solar scale-up, natural gas, road transport, and buildings are some of the ones that are kind of at play at the moment. But rather than talk about what we might do in the future, we thought we'd stop here, and then if you have questions about any of those, we can kind of do a deeper delve into the areas that we'd like to explore further. But we'll stop there and open it up to questions. Thanks.
Thank you for that talk. I'm wondering if you can speak to the assumptions underlying your matrix.
Right.
And one assumption that I think I'm hearing is that there's this privileging of concentrating power in decision making in as few actors as possible.
Right.
And I wonder if that's the case, are there any drawbacks with that? Is it better to democratize, right, the production of energy or the production of anything in the economic sector? Is that better for the people of India instead of concentrating or centralizing the means of production in just a few companies or decision-making processes in just a few governments?
Yeah, I think some of the theoretical insights come from previous work that I've done on pharmaceuticals. And I think market power, as I said, can lead to political opposition, but it also can lead to swift transformation if the actors in that space decide to do so or are pushed to do so. And the challenge is, if we think about if what's demanded of that sector is perceived as an existential crisis for that sector, like you shall cease to exist tobacco companies or coal companies, then they may fight you till the death, right? Now, so I think that's a problem on some level if market concentration confers political power and they are thoroughly opposed to action. But if you're asking for them to transform their operations to become more efficient, say air conditioning industry or automobile industry, and they see a future in new higher efficiency standards, and if you can figure out some transition platform by which they begin to seize a large share of the market in the future, then that can be good for emissions mitigation. It may be problematic from the perspective of economic competition or sort of if you're worried about inequality or other metrics. Now, just because you have a concentrated market to make that beginning transition doesn't necessarily mean you want to stay there. You might want to encourage more competition in that space to the extent that the competition is based on that higher standard of efficiency. So I think that there are other things beyond just, other metrics, normative metrics or policy metrics that we have to bring to bear. But I think the structural analysis helps us understand why fragmentation is a barrier to action. Now, I think there's an alternative model here, which is something like the cell phone technology diffusion, parallel, which is sort of bottoms up, people seeing, and this is less on the production side, but more in terms of technology adoption. And I think that's an interesting case as we think about solar scale up and sort of distributed power. Is there a model by which this becomes something that is self-replicating because it's so desirable? And it's hard to see quite that when you think about the access to medicines is another case in which you might imagine that's also true, in that access to medicines, if it's the difference between life and death, then you could imagine that people would demand it, except if they lack purchasing power on their own to be able to achieve those life-saving drugs, then you need government intervention to provide for them. So the sort of bottom-up revolution of the cell phone diffusion may have been conditional in part because the technologies were cheap enough that most people could afford them. Some of the interventions like antiretroviral drugs or in the energy space, solar, they might not be the kinds of things that can take off on their own without support. So I think this is a theme that is one that we want to explore more, and we're not fully satisfied with it, but we think it's worth putting out there on the table. But most of the observations in the energy space, WRI did a study in 2007 on sectoral feasibility, and they thought industry concentration was an important factor in thinking about mitigations potential. And then looking at the historical studies on why CFCs were easier to phase out, the studies from Todd Sandler at UT Dallas talked about, there were a handful of companies that produced CFCs. DuPont was one of them. They were going to get rich off the alternative to CFC market. And so, again, from a structural transformation perspective, it was seen as helpful, although might have its downsides on other dimensions.
So I'll just add one small comment to that, is you can see this at play at an international politics plane, right? Because when President Obama wanted to solve the climate problem or take a stab at it, the focus was first to do a bilateral with China, right? The two big concentrated actors that were brought into the room, and that was a foundation for then India and others to join. And that was a strategy adopted in a sense. I don't think they read our paper, but I think, yeah, seriously speaking, it seems like, yes, but yeah, as Josh said, that point of yours is valid on other spaces. So.
Hi. I had a question about the buildings, which I see as one of your further research topics. So first off, just to clarify, were you saying that there was a certain percentage of buildings projected to exist by 2030 that were not yet constructed? Was that the phrasing? And what was that percentage again?
Yeah. So the urbanization patterns in India are tremendously transformational, right? So India is going to be, it's 30% urbanized now, it's going to be 50% by 2030, and then it will hit 60 or 70 down the road. So you have 70% of your, this is an estimate, right? 70% of the buildings that will exist in 2030 are yet to be built.
Okay. And I was curious, like, for your future research, you're going to delve at all into the like options for, like, you know, recycling materials and like how that ecosystem might work as well. I was just kind of curious, like, what further topics you're going to research on that topic, or in that area, sorry.
I think on the buildings front, I mean, you know, are there opportunities for concentrated nodes upstream? But either, you know, Sarang mentioned that only a handful, that even among the large developers, they're not responsible for a significant share of the market. And so are there concentrated nodes upstream that one might be able to use as a way of sort of leveraging structural power either on the market side or the government side to achieve more efficiency? You know, we noted that the cement sector is very efficient. Now, is there a way that some of the consolidated practices in the cement sector can be transferred as sort of fungible, either lessons learned or more structural power in terms of, if you're going to buy our cement, you have to embody it in your building space in a particular way that includes more insulation. It's unclear if those producers have any leverage over the people that buy their product. There are other products that might be more efficient still as alternatives to cement. So I think, I mean, then there's the kind of classic challenge of, you know, the person who builds the building isn't the person who occupies the rental space, so how do you overcome those sort of incentive problems of investing in efficiency? I think that's the kind of logic that we might deploy in our work, which is less on the technical economic side and more on the political organizational of how to resolve the challenges of split incentives or this wider issue of looking for concentrated nodes. If we think that, you know, the air conditioning market is a case in point, right? That there are a handful of companies that produce air conditioners. India is vastly under air conditioned compared to, like, you know, we think about our buildings on campus as being too cold. They've got a different problem where not enough people have air conditioning, and once they get it, it could be, you know, window units that are, you know, not even up to contemporary standards of efficiency in U.S., European, or Japanese markets. So but there may be a handful of companies there. So there's better leverage probably on the appliance side than there is maybe on the building construction side. But that could again be the kind of leverage that our theoretical analysis would lend towards. And I actually think that people are already moving in that space in the air conditioning, so they don't need to read our paper, they're already doing it. But are there parallels in the wider buildings construction space? We haven't gone there, but I think we might.
Yeah. So the one small example I can mention on the recycling space is actually from the upstream end. So a lot of the fly ash, the ash that's produced in coal plants, is being used to make cement. And you know, so you have this so-called blended cement that's, you know, now a substantial part of Indian building production, and it is supposed to be safe once it's sited inside the cement matrix. So that's cut back some of these energy usage patterns in the building space a little bit. So it's just one micro example.
Yes, I've yet to read an article about oil prices worldwide that has the word India in it. And do you see the growth in road transport in India as causing people to look at India as a major player in setting world oil prices?
Right. So we didn't look at oil prices in the study. So just based on the overall economics of consumption of oil and how that contributes to carbon, it's still small in India because transportation, although growing extremely fast, still remains, you know, not many people have cars, and there's many more two-wheelers, but even that's not by any means the majority of the population. So oil consumption is growing, and India imports 70% plus of its oil, and it's going to go to 90 by 2030. So it's a substantial issue for energy security folks, but it's also an issue for in terms of carbon emissions. And the price actually is much lower now. So if anything, it was a crisis, 3-4 years ago. I think India was spending $150 billion a year importing oil, which is a very large amount of money for India. And now it's come down, to less than half of that. So, but the markets are going to go as the markets go. So you have to see. I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah.
Comments on the first one and the third and the future study. And I liked what you've been doing. The first one on the solar scale-up, I think an important aspect there is, given India's goal for increased solar, together with increased penetration of EVs, there's a huge opportunity here for distributed solar generation to be hooked up to the transportation sector. Secondly, having done some work on road transport or the emission side, I like you talking about both the mobility and the emissions, because it's a very hot issue, particularly in Delhi, vis-a-vis mobility compared to emissions. It's not quite as easy as you put it, because you have to have policy which requires the oil companies to provide the fuel that the car companies need with their advanced technology.
Right.
Yeah.
And syncing that is not always easy. So you've got the case of Reliant producing very clean fuel for Europe, but they weren't having the cars to supply in India. That's improving, but then you also have to look at the railroads and also the rapidly growing airlines. So I think, again, I compliment you on what you're doing, and clearly there's a lot of work ahead.
Yeah, that raises a slightly different issue, which is, so the paper that we did for the Paulson Institute on China recognized that air pollution was a more potent driver of policy change in the Chinese setting than climate change itself. And I think that's starting to be true in India as well. You think about, mentioned Delhi, while I was there in December, they were about to embark on their odd-even scheme, where on some days you could drive and other days you couldn't, depending on when your license plate ended. And the air quality was worse than I'd seen it when I went to Beijing a few years ago. And so thinking about the human health effects that nobody, not even government officials, really can evade, other than, filters in your office and your home. But anytime you step outside and it's sort of grim and dark and hazy, I think is going to impel policy change faster. And so people often talk about what are the co-benefits that climate policy can generate for air pollution. And we, in our Paulson paper, said, flip it. What are the potential climate co-benefits of air pollution policy? Because air pollution policy may drive things faster. And we think precisely in the automobile space that's going to happen. So the dirty diesel cars, there's going to be movement on that for air pollution reasons, but if done right, will generate major benefits for climate. But there are also hazards of how it can be done poorly. So in the Chinese setting, there was some movements to move coal-burning power plants further away from Beijing. That may deliver air pollution benefits, but won't deliver those climate benefits. So I think that similar style of analysis is going to be potent here, and I think those are going to be the major drivers of policy change in the short run, more even than climate policy. So I think that's a helpful insight for people who are interested in climate mitigation, is to focus on the other things that are really important to states: energy security, human health, and economics, and then maybe climate change at the bottom.
Hi. So you talked about natural gas just a little bit, that there is a large barrier for India to implement more natural gas powered generation, and that's one of your future research topics. Can you talk a little bit more about what are you going to look at in the future for natural gas in India? And I mean, do you have any insights about how India can get more, can achieve more natural gas generation capacity in the future?
Yeah. So there are multiple barriers in natural gas. So one of them has been the price historically, right? The LNG landed price in Asia is much higher than shale gas prices here are rock bottom. But landed prices were, till 2 years ago, really high in Asia, $16 an MBTU, 17, 415. They've come down. They've come down to 8 or 7, but that's still too high. If you compare it to domestic coal, or even imported coal, it doesn't yet make sense for India to massively import large amounts of LNG. Having said that, India has increased its imports of LNG, but that in many ways power produced is more expensive. In fact, most of the gas plants in India, and that's about 24 gigs of the total 282 gigawatts, I think, that's less than 10% is natural gas. They're running at 20% plant loads because it's just not economical to sell that power for the generator in terms of utilities are not going to buy it at that price. So they don't have an incentive. So this stranded nature of natural gas plants in India is a serious concern. This government has been trying to do something about it. But ultimately the fundamentals are problematic and no government can change the global situation. So that's one issue. The second issue is you would think, well, why not get to, let's get away from LNG and get it some other way. And the some other way is pipelines, right? And pipeline gas, if done right, would be cheaper. And there you get into the international relations, geopolitics space much more because there are 4 pipelines that have been conceptualized at various points. And one you have is the India-Pakistan-Iran pipeline, the most famous one, the so-called peace pipeline. It didn't bring much peace, but it didn't bring anything. The project is dead. Then you have the India-Oman pipeline. That's an undersea pipeline. Technical challenges. I'm told the challenges are more amenable now to solution, but the cost, that just raises the cost. You've got to leverage the capital in international markets. Those guys want returns. There's a whole host of things you have to do. The other one is India-Bangladesh, because Bangladesh has gas. But Bangladesh has taken a position of, let's say, sovereignty on that. And they have placed sovereignty ahead of markets. And they have said that this gas is for us, for the most part. So they have not exported it so far to India. And then you have Myanmar. And there were real possibilities of a Myanmar, Bangladesh, India, or Myanmar, India pipeline. Barriers there are insurgencies in India's northeast. And then China got the bid, right? So, as it usually does. So that failed. So all the pipeline projects have failed. The only one that actually has a chance of success is what's called TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India. And when you have so many countries in there, that's trouble, right? So, and you've been reading the news about Afghanistan and the return of bad actors and so forth. So the world, the global dispensation is aligned towards TAPI, but the underlying local and regional security dynamics are not favorable. And unless that changes, unless there's a reasonable peace settlement there or some kind of a guarantee, it's a question mark. So that's, and then there are other barriers. I don't know. We have time for that. We can go on. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thanks. So with respect to the electricity in the bad boy box there that was most difficult, I often hear that India is a potentially great market for microgrids. And some of the dynamics around that seem to be normal dynamics with respect to scale economies and large utilities that can deliver electricity at more competitive prices and lower prices get broken with politicians giving away electricity, theft of electricity and such not. But at a local level, it's far more difficult to steal your village's electricity because there's just a mechanism there to help self-police. And so is your analysis with the electricity segment being the lower left-hand more difficult box with the paradigm of the traditional large-scale scale economies context, or does it already include the notion of perhaps substantial microgrid applications that could make small batteries combined with PV at the village level more economic?
So I think it comes back to the first question about, is there sort of a parallel like from the cell phone technology diffusion phenomenon. Is there a way for the microgrid to, because you're thinking about the challenges of scaling up so that it displaces enough either existing coal, or if they're not, or that future coal, to the extent that this solves the energy access problem. And I think, some of the early signs in the solar space are that the government's first inclination is we're going to do large solar parks, which seems to be, they have notional plans of doing a fairly significant amount of rooftop solar, I think 40 gigawatts, but most of the policy planning and efforts are focused on large-scale solar park rollout. Again, probably because one of the things we want to explore is are they doing that because the transaction costs of doing a few large projects are easier? It's kind of like the problems of microfinance traditionally, that small-scale people were unbanked because the transaction costs of figuring out whether or not you should bank them are higher than the cost of the loan, so you just didn't do it. So is the microgrids, if you're doing this at the community level, is there a way to do this so that people just end up doing this and the private sector provides this as a service on their own, and then it kind of magnifies up? Is there some sort of kind of big break in how this service is delivered? I think that's something that we're struggling with in this country. I don't know if India, as a kind of more level playing ground for that, since there are hundreds of millions of people that have never had electricity, that it's going to be easier to roll it out. We'll see, but I think that's the kind of style of analysis we want to explore. Are there models from other countries? When I went to Turkey a few years ago, I noticed that every house had a solar water heater. Now, I don't think that's just purely market-driven. I think that was something about the nature of the Turkish state that was able to help that happen. So how do you make markets with state support for things that wouldn't happen on their own? That's where we're headed.
So one example of the state actually leveraging, playing a big role in creating a market is CFL lamps in India, because the state has set up a procurement agency and has been quite successful in changing the demand curve, thereby changing the price dynamic. And once you get the price point shifting, then you have people on their own going out and getting it. You don't need the state to fund them or to help them, right? They just do it. So that's a success story. But obviously CFL lamps is a bit easier than setting up solar microgrids. So.
Well, thank you so much, Josh.